Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats, we're going to start in just about 1 or 2 minutes' time. Thanks very much. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for coming, joining us here at the Centre for Global Development. I'm Rajesh Mirchandani. I'm the Senior Director of Communication and Policy Outreach here, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here this morning for this interesting discussion on inequality and fiscal policy. Let me start by showing you a slide. I'm sure you'll all recognise some of these images. 2011. The Occupy protests spread around the world. The idea of the 99% versus the 1% became a powerful meme. It dominated the US presidential election in 2012 and other elections subsequently around the world, in the UK, in Brazil and Indonesia as well. The central theme was inequality. So it's been at the heart of the political debate for several years, and for those of us who are interested in international development and economics and global poverty, there are also solid economic reasons why it is so current too. Maybe not so solid, according to one of our speakers. We'll hear more about that later. Firstly, developing countries now account for a greater share of global economic output, which means inequality between countries has gone down. But as Occupy, in the rich world at least, kept reminding us, inequality within many countries has gone up. We may hear a bit of a refutation of that from one of the speakers later on. But let's use that as the basis for our discussion. Does that mean that it is inevitable that as countries grow richer, they become more unequal? How can you ensure there's growth and equity? What are the best policies to address concerns about inequality while promoting economic efficiency and robust growth at the same time? And what have been the experiences of major developing nations that are growing richer but more unequal? These are some of the issues and themes that we'll address today with our esteemed panel. I'd like to invite you all to come up on stage now and take your seats while I introduce you. So, first of all, we're delighted to welcome Min Su, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, who will consider the implications of the changing nature of inequality on the IMF's core activity of safeguarding global macroeconomic stability. Don't be shy, panel. Come along. Nancy Birdsall, you recognise, CGD's founding president, will consider new ideas for progressive taxation that are both efficient and equitable and don't hurt growth. Nora Lustig, Professor of Latin American Economics at Tulane University in New Orleans, where she runs the Commitment to Equity project that seeks to analyse the impact of taxation and social spending on inequality and poverty, a world expert in this. She's also a CGD non-resident fellow and a member of the new World Bank Global Poverty Commission. She'll consider whether richer countries redistribute more and draw some conclusions from her own work in this area. And Anit Mukherjee, another CGD colleague, CGD's IDRC fellow. Before coming here, he spent many years working in and around the government in India. He brings huge expertise on India's struggles with poverty, finance, and public services, especially in health and education. It's great to see you all, our esteemed panel. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Let's give them a round of applause to begin with.
That's nice. That's nice.
You haven't even done anything and you're getting applause.
Exactly.
Keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Now, each speaker will talk for around 5 minutes, drawing on maybe 1 or 2 slides. Some have slides, some do not. Then I'll pose a couple of questions. And then when it becomes rapidly apparent that I have no clue what I'm talking about, I will look to you, audience, to save my further blushes for open questions. So let's kick off. Min-Soo, great to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me pose a couple of questions for you that hopefully will kick off your comments. How does the changing nature of inequality impact the IMF's work on macroeconomic stability? What is the IMF's role in helping policymakers design the right policies to address inequality? And then the IMF recently published a new book on this topic. You will be able to see a copy of it out there. Please take one with you. What does the book suggest that countries can do to achieve their equity goals? Over to you.
Great. Thank you. And first of all, thanks for the invitation and to join this great event. Thank you, Nancy, and for institutes hold this event. And also, I think it's great we had the free breakfast and the free prod before we even say anything. This is very unusual, but it's put a tremendous pressure on me, I guess, not on all of yours. So we have to work hard to earn that back. 3 questions you answer. Let me briefly sort of you answer these 3 issues. The first issue is why it's important for IMF. We did a study. We realized high inequality is associated with the macro instability and the lower growth. We also did study. We found the lower inequality is associated with sustainable growth. So inequality is really a macro issue now. I think this is really the new frontier studies because it's really different from the previous study. Previously, it's always growth and income inequality. You cannot get both. Today, I think it's more and more the consensus we can and we should. So that brings the issue to the macro agenda, which is very much IMF mandates. So the second question you answer is what IMF to do. I think we bring this issue to the policy dialogue, to the agenda in all 3 of our mandates. The first issue is we do for the program. When we do the lending, now we pay attention on the income inequality issues, which is new, which is actually very effective. We did a study in Africa region, for example. We compare the countries with our program or without program, the peers. What we found is country with our program has a 1 percentage point of GDP higher in the expenditure in education and health care, and income distribution situation is better and compared with the previous and all those things. I think that's very encouraging things for us. And we also put this issue into the policy dialogue, into the article for consultation. And also, particularly upon the request by the authorities, by members, we will do more studies to fit in the local situation that helps them to cope with the income inequality issues, which is also new. And I have to say that IMF never done that before. We always on the fiscal side, the monetary policy, but whatever. Now, third issue which is also our key business. We do a lot of technical assistance. And previously, most of the technical assistance focused on the revenue side, on the expenditure side, and I'm focused on fiscal area. But now we also put income inequality issues into the policy designs, into the fiscal policy framework, into the monetary policy framework, input into the macro stability framework as well. I think that's very important because that's not only, so that's a follow-up the policy dialogue supplied by the capacity and building to help the authority to build a system they can implement the policy they want. I think those are very important issues. So those are what we'll do. Now, the book is really provide a lot of interesting and policy advices we experienced in the past few years. So we bring them together. So it's a very good book. I hope at this moment you have the book in your hands already. I hope you read the book 3 times already. Yeah. I would say, I hope you read it 3 times already. I hope you will read 10 times after this conference or this seminar. The message is very straightforward. The first issue is income inequalities increase. In the past 30 years, in almost all the countries except a few, Sweden, Denmark, and a few, all the country income inequality increase. And this is bad. The second message is also very straightforward. The fiscal policy is still the most effective, most useful instruments to dealing with income inequality. We found in advanced economy, for example, through the transfer and the tax policies, the fiscal policy can reduce the Gini coefficient from the market Gini to the disposable income Gini roughly 1/3, which is a big margin, roughly for the advanced economy from roughly 44% to roughly 30%. So can reduce roughly 0.14, which is quite a big margin. But we found it's not the same thing in the developing countries. So they still have quite a big margin and quite a big room positively to use in the future policy work as well. And on the fiscal policy, tax policy clearly is the key issues. And make the tax policy more progressive is one thing. And there's a lot of other tax you can use. Property tax is very useful. Inheritance and the gifts tax is another one. And tax on the high wealth individuals is also a very hard issues on the policy agenda now, and more policy discussions on those issues as well. So there's quite a lot of new tax instruments we can use to help reduce the income inequality as well. Expenditure policy also important. Right? Expenditure on the infrastructures, educations, on the healthcare, on those things is very important. In Brazil, they have a expenditure policy called cash for girl in school. It's a cash transfer if you bring your girl to the school, which is very effective. It's quickly bring the girls, the enrollment ratio in the school increase dramatically. And more or less we see those things, for example, in Bangladesh, in all those other countries. And those are very important, not even mention the general investments in the education else and social protection as well. So expenditure also very important. Improving efficiency has a huge room to improve the income, not include, to reduce income inequality. It's 2 directions. I take one example, for example, in energy subsidies. Today, the energy subsidy total cost the whole world $336 billion directly from budget. And we calculate, if you took all the scheduled costs, all the environmental impact, all those indirect costs into the whole thing, the energy subsidy costs of $5.3 trillion per year for this year, for the whole world, which is huge number, but top 20 people receive more than 40% total subsidy. The bottom 40 people receive less than 20% total subsidy. It doesn't work at all. In many of these countries, in say Zimbabwe, sort of credit subsidies, because too general and money goes to big farmers, and so target subsidy policy works much more effective to help the poor and the low-income country to reduce income inequality. So there's a lot of room for improved efficiency as well. So bring things together. I think this is a book, bring all these cases. I hope you will enjoy this book. But I have to be very careful, humble, because I'm not the author. I'm the salesperson. And Laura is the author of the 1 chapter. The real editor, Sanjay, is here. So he is the real Sanjay, stand up, please. Yeah. We should give him. Oh, this is also our chief auditor. We should give them a big applause. They bring the book to us. But I like the book, so I'm very happy to be the salesman. Also, on behalf of the IMF, will say the fund is committed on this income inequality issues because we more and more see this is such important today, have a macro impact, both on the macro stability and on growth as well. Thank you. I will stop here.
I want to keep up the theme of applauding people as often as we can, especially when they do something. Thank you very much for your comments there, Minzu, which have framed the discussion very well. Nora Lustig, let's turn to you. Minzu there saying countries can have greater growth and less inequality. I know that there's a kind of basic premise in the book that you disagree with, which you're going to hear more about, which is very interesting. But tell us also, what does your work in this field say about this idea of greater growth and less inequality? Is it inevitable that as countries grow richer, they become more unequal? And how can they address that? I'm going to click through your slides when you are ready, so please go for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank CGD for allowing to be part of this panel. You're my second home in DC, so I'm really pleased to be here. And thank you to the IMF for having me invited to be part of your book, which is amazing. I just got my own copy, so I'm looking forward also to reading through all the other chapters besides my own, which I read, of course. The other thing I wanted to say is that, first of all, it's quite amazing the change of view that is in the IMF today. Nancy will remember back in the 1980s and the 1990s how hard it was to bring in distributional issues to the IMF discourse, much less to the IMF programs. I remember vividly when I used to work on the social cost of adjustment, I was invited to the IMF, my previous incarnation when I was at Brookings, sometimes to give presentations. And whenever I raised the issue of distributional issues, it was, no, we don't get into that. That's internal decisions. So it's an amazing change and a very welcome one and a very important one. That was my first point. The second point I wanted to make is to introduce some caveats about the picture of what's happened to inequality in the world. So Rajesh, if you can show the slide. In the last 15 years, actually, we have, these are developing countries. I don't have the rich countries. It's a graph. It's 78 developing countries with data collected from the World Bank POV-CAL database. And some are consumption-based, other income-based. You can see all the footnotes in the a paper that's going to come out soon. The red here signal declines in inequality, measured with the Gini coefficient, but even if you use other indicators, it shows a decline as well. The green shows an increase. So it turns out that in the 78 country sample that we have here, which does not include the rich countries, about 45 experience a decline, 30 an increase, and 3 no change. I think that we have to be aware that in the last 15 years we have experienced declining inequality in part of the world. That part of the world is a world that I've been studying for a long time, Latin America. And practically in all of the countries in Latin America in the last decade, there was growth and there was a decline in inequality. So you had a combination of both, which is very felicitous. Inequality is still very high in Latin America, so there's still a long way to go if we want to have inequality levels that would be morally and acceptable also from an efficiency point of view. But it's good news that it has declined. The caveat I have to make about this data, and I guess your data has that problem too, for developing countries, we don't have the top. We don't have the 1%. They're not in the surveys. And here, I'm going to take the opportunity to make a plea to the IMF, because we need data from other sources, not household surveys. We need the data from tax returns, which is how in the US, the UK, Germany, France, Thomas Piketty and his co-authors have calculated what goes to the top 1%. Of course, with all the caveats, you don't have to have people identified by their names. They're anonymous data, but they allow you to see how much concentration of income and wealth goes to the top. And a lot of the developing countries do not want to share this data. So if we want transparency and accountability and introduce fiscal reforms that are acceptable in general, we need to have access to that data as well. And I think it'd be good if the IMF begins to ask that maybe in the Article 4. I don't know how you decide those things. But I think it has to be part of the data that's shared when we talk about fiscal policy. So we have this decline in inequality. I've studied it a lot in Latin America. What were the main factors behind it? One of the main factors was the decline in wage inequality. And what was behind that? It was the expansion of education. Access to education resulted in an upgrading, and most of the people that were at the bottom had more years of education. People at the top, there were more people with tertiary education. That brought the skill premium down. People who had tertiary relative to people who had complete primary, that narrowed. That was one of the major forces, and fiscal policy has been behind that because the expansion of education had to do with the expansion of spending on education and also demographics, because fewer people needed to go to the primary schooling with the demographic transition. The other important factor in explaining the decline in inequality in Latin America were transfers. Before Latin America, as many countries in the world still were using general subsidies as one redistributive tool. And that, as you mentioned, is very inefficient because you spend a lot of money on those who don't need it. In the 90s in particular, there was a big shift in Latin America going away from general price subsidies. It started some countries in the 80s, but in the 90s, a big shift, especially in Mexico. It eliminated, Mexico was a pioneer with Brazil, together with Brazil, in introducing the targeted cash transfers. And they had eliminated the general subsidies and moved a lot of the resources to targeted cash transfers. Those were an important component of what explains the decline in inequality, the famous CCTs, the conditional cash transfers, and also non-contributory pensions. Those were the two arms that the state used in Latin America to redistribute income. Interestingly, if you look at how much countries are devoting tax-based resources to redistribution currently, they're doing much more than when the rich countries were as poor as the developing countries are today. I've been looking at data from Peter Lindert, who's an economic historian, and compared to this, so there's been a lifting of the threshold of the commitment of the states to actually engage in redistribution. And I'm trying to sort of write something next year during my sabbatical to explain what is behind this upgrading of the welfare states. That may be accompanied by a lower, if you want, institutional capacity. So a lot of the criticisms that we are staging against the developing world in terms of its ability to redistribute with quality may be because the quantity went faster than the advances you need at the institutional level. Let me show you the next graph, which shows redistribution. This is part of a paper also that will be out soon. The EU27 comes from Euromod, which is a project like ours, but which looks at the advanced countries. The USA data comes from a paper of ours, and the CEQ, when I say ours, I mean the Commitment to Equity project. And the lower one is an average of 7 middle-income countries that include Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa, and others. Look at something that's very interesting. The grays are the amount of redistribution, the decline in the Gini, shown as going up, but those are decline in Gini points on the left-hand side. If you think pensions are transfers, if you think pensions are deferred income, meaning that people put in while they were working and they collect when they retired, those are the blue ones. Redistribution in the advanced world, in particular in the European Union, is much higher if you really think that part of the welfare state is pensions. And we always show the two results because the truth is probably in between. But the differences narrow tremendously when you think that pensions are not a transfer. In fact, if you put South Africa separately in that graph, South Africa redistributes as much as the US if you treat pensions as not a transfer, okay? So it's very interesting, the differences are not so striking. Nevertheless, it is true that in general, redistribution is much lower in countries that are not part of the advanced world, but much higher than probably it was, like I said, when these were as poor as the developing countries today. Now, interestingly also, we found in our work, contrary to the historians, Peter Lindert's work, that fortunately we have a Robin Hood. Redistribution is higher the more unequal. Peter Lindert in history, looking at 18th, 19th century, found the more unequal, the less redistribution. So there's been a change, and he attributes this a lot to democratization. which is also a very interesting hypothesis. Now, I have spoken about redistribution, inequality. Now I want to bring another dimension of well-being that now that inequality is so much on the agenda, we tend to forget, and it's poverty. Turns out, we found in many of our countries that even though fiscal redistribution is inequality decreasing, it can be poverty increasing. You can have exactly opposite results. How can that be? It happens because when we talk about inequalities, relative incomes. When we talk about poverty, it's levels. So think about a very, very progressive tax system, but it still taxes the poor, and the poor don't receive anything afterwards. That would reduce inequality a lot, but it would increase poverty because some of the poor would be paying net into the system. So where do we find that poverty might be higher after you include not only direct taxes, but also consumption taxes, which are often, I don't care if they're unequalizing or not, I worry if they're poverty increasing. So we found it in countries that are very poor. Which ones? For example, poor and very unequal, like Guatemala. We found it in Ethiopia. We found this in Ghana. We found this in Armenia. And in Brazil, although we do not find that, we have a new measure that actually looks at what happens to the Brazilian poor after you include consumption taxes. And after the transfers, 40% of the post-fiscal poor were impoverished by the fiscal system. So I want to end with a point. I think that now that there is so much emphasis on domestic resource mobilization, we're going to have to be very careful about what that means, but from the poverty point of view. Because when, in particular, for example, I'm all in favor of eliminating these general subsidies that send a lot of money to those who don't need it, but when you eliminate it, you should calculate what is the cost to the poor, not only to anonymous poverty measurement, but how many of the poor may become net payers or larger amounts of net payers, and then think about whether we have the mechanisms to compensate them. Because we may end up doing something good for inequality, but bad for the poor, and I think that that's why I want to bring back the issue of poverty as front and center. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora Lustig. Nancy Birdsall. Nora made some really interesting points about the richer a country gets, the more unequal a country gets, the more it redistributes. She also made the point about disagreeing with Min Zhu about inequality growing within countries. There's a lot of issues going on here. So thinking for policymakers, Nancy, what are the ideas you think are best available to them on the tax side? I know something that you've worked a lot on, that can help kind of solve this conundrum.
Great. Well, thank you, Rajesh. I'm going to answer that question in a minute. First, I want to say that I'm repeating much of what Min Zhu and Nora Lustig said, and that's because I read all of their stuff, all of the IMF stuff and all of Nora Lustig's stuff.
Thank you.
And it's
That's fantastic.
a lot of it is in this book.
So I should send you more papers.
Yeah, send me more papers. I'd like to read those papers on inequality and fiscal policy. So the first slide I have is another illustration of how different it is in the advanced compared to the developing countries. I think most of those developing countries are Latin America, again, where we have these better household data. So the red shows you market-based inequality, and the green shows you inequality after the state has played a role through taxes and transfers in redistribution. And the point is the simple one that Min Zhu made. In the advanced economies, the state plays a major role in reducing here the Gini coefficient. It's such a big difference. It illustrates for me how we need effective, strong states in the world if we're going to deal with issues like inequality and poverty, as well as governance in general. So that was one of the important points that Min Zhu was making. It is fantastic that the IMF has discovered and shown effectively that what they've actually concluded in various papers is redistribution has a neutral effect on growth, except through its effect on reducing inequality, which has a positive effect on growth. So that's the first thing I want to say, repeating. The second thing I wanted to say is also building on and answering Rajesh's question and building on some of what my Minzu and Nora said. The traditional economic wisdom, the conventional wisdom, has been that what the state should do is maximize revenue in order to redistribute through expenditures. So there's the tax side and the expenditure side. The conventional wisdom, including at the IMF, at the World Bank, in the economic profession, has been pretty much you go for efficiency on the tax side and maximize revenue and then deal with your inequality issues by doing the right set of expenditures, including by spending on health and education, as Nora explained, for Latin America. And it's true that this can work. At the same time, my sense is, and I think this is something worth looking at more carefully with research, that in many developing countries, sort of politically, we've used up a lot of the potential on the expenditure side to do redistribution. Nora gave the excellent examples in Latin America. There was, over the last 30 years, particularly, I guess, after the 80s, it sort of stalled in the 80s, but 70s and then 90s, 2000s, increases in spending on education and health, and those have fed in, especially on education, to reduced wage inequality now. Perhaps at risk, honestly, with the declining commodity prices, because the commodity boom was very good for relatively to middle skilled labor. But in any event, the foundation was laid. But at the same time, we have evidence, including by work of colleagues at CGD, my own work, that the education sector in particular is pretty inefficient. You have a phenomenon of schooling, lots of schooling, without a lot of learning. So that children in Brazil, maybe less so, but now more and more we see in Africa and the poorest parts of India, that children finish 6th grade. In Tanzania, they can't, after 5th grade, read one single word in their own language of Kiswahili. 40% can't do that. So, you know, there's a limit to how much you can keep shoving on the expenditure side money to the poor. I think the limit on cash transfers, it reaches a point, even the conditional cash transfers in Brazil that Minzu mentioned. So then the question is, what about the tax side? What is the potential on the tax side? And we heard personal income taxes. Let's get the data on personal income. Let's first have personal income taxes. Let me show the second slide. It's a little hard to see. I think the red is the value-added tax and other indirect taxes. And what you see on the left, that, well, the US is an outlier and Canada. Green is personal income taxes, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So you see that in Canada and the US, there's a lot more emphasis on personal income taxes than on consumption taxes, and this is just federal. In the second group is the EU. It's a little bit more balanced. In Latin America, even more reliance on consumption and other indirect taxes, and it's primarily the VAT, the value-added tax. So the value-added tax is hard to make even neutral. It tends to tax more the relatively poor because they consume more of their income. So the question is whether in the next round of work, and I'm happy to hear Minzu saying it will happen, the IMF won't help, particularly the lowest income countries, begin the long, hard slog of developing the institutional arrangements for other kinds of taxes, not necessarily to cut back on the VAT, which is a very efficient revenue raiser, but to begin to work on the foundation for personal income taxes and property taxes, which are more common in Latin America, but even less common in the non-decentralized settings of many of the world's poorest countries. This would have, you know, the fringe benefit that of having ability eventually to look at the top 1% and the top 5%, where household data are completely almost useless, I think. Now, one of the reasons why I think this is important, and maybe it reflects my history, you know, growing up in the US, the first time you have a summer job in the US, you're shocked when your paycheck comes and a third of it is gone to this Social Security and some taxes that you never thought about. So in the US, people understand that they're paying taxes, and that is kind of good for democracy and accountability and transparency and a sense of you can make your local political leadership accountable at least. So that's my pitch for starting to think more about personal income taxes, even where it's not the most efficient revenue raiser. It has this fringe benefit that is probably good for building more accountable government and for supporting more democratic government in the medium term, and wealth taxes as well. Now, I wanted to show you the third slide, which emphasizes Nora's point. It's a little confusing. This is the fiscal incidence between taxes and transfers for a group of people that Nora and I call the strugglers in a paper that we did together. The strugglers are people who are not middle class, so they're not income secure, but they're not below even their national poverty lines, or maybe they're at or below, just below their national poverty lines. More or less in Latin America, and this is from Brazil, I think this picture, yes, Brazil, people between about $4 per capita per day, $4 per person per day, and $10 per day. When, you know, at $6 to $7 per day in Latin America, we know from panel data that there's a very high probability still, say 50%, of falling back into poverty, below your national poverty line in the subsequent 3 or 4 years. We know that from very good work of another colleague of Nora's and mine who works on Latin America. So these people are poor by my definition. You know, we don't call them poor in the World Bank, $1.90 a day now, but they're poor, they're struggling. They are one shock away at the household level, one person sick, one, you know, their house is robbed, their vegetable cart is destroyed, whatever, from falling back into poverty. And what the red shows is that after taxes and transfers, you see how it goes below the line, their income is as much as, I think it's 7%, I forget, lower than their initial market or disposable income. So that's Nora's point, translated not for the poor, but for this second group of people who are the emerging middle class. They're the fragile, incipient, say, middle class, who again are the backbone, I think, of an accountable state in the medium term. Now, if you add the benefits from the state spending, the in-kind benefits on health and education, then they're better off, for sure. The question, however, is how much do they value that education in particular? We know, especially in Brazil, these people are starting to opt out of public schools. So it may look like an in-kind benefit valued at the average cost per child that the government is putting out, but in fact, maybe not, because they're opting out. So this goes back to the question of the quality of the schooling. And do I think an important point that cash income matters? If we only count on in-kind income, in-kind benefits, it's taking away from people a lot of their own discretion and their own choices compared to having the cash transfers. So let me stop at that and say I sort of apologize for repeating some of what you already heard, but I think it reflects a good move in the direction of the IMF and the development community toward more focus on how to deal with inequality, and within that set of fiscal policy, taxes and expenditures, maybe it's time for a little bit more push on the tax side.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Anit Mukherjee, fiscal policy doesn't start from zero. There are prior conditions the countries must take into account. In India's case, as you've been telling me, IMF policies in the early 90s led to cuts in health and education spending. For the last decade, we know India has seen a lot of growth, but there's still rising inequality. What are the implications of those previous conditions for what India should do now?
Thank you, Rajesh, and good morning. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, very, very humbled because I haven't done much work on income inequality and not published many papers, but what I bring to the table is essentially a policymaker's perspective, looking at a country which goes through a structural adjustment process. And there are many countries and many people in this room have kind of experienced that in their own careers. So, as is very well known, India had to take a loan, a structural adjustment loan from the IMF in 1991, Rajesh, the first name. But what is less well known is that I was an undergraduate student, first year undergrad, exactly the year when the IMF loan came. And as
Which
Rajesh,
one is you?
Guess. And it was an interesting time. I mean, I'm showing this photograph because I think when I was starting off understanding what economics is all about, you have this whole new paradigm that is thrust on you in the way that you tend to think of what economics as a science is. So first year of my college was essentially spent writing placards saying IMF and World Bank should kind of get out of India. And looking at also, going to the streets to protest. We didn't know it was before Facebook and all that, so we didn't know that there were such things going on across the globe at that time, right? But we had some company. These were tribal women who were displaced by a big project. I shouldn't have showed this, but at least it's called the World Bank, but not the IMF. But so there was a huge groundswell of protest against policies which favored the paradigm rather than taking into account what the grassroots were thinking. And this is just one project, and there were several throughout the 90s. So the point I'm trying to make is that when a country goes through a structural adjustment program, it is a contested political space. But how the country actually accepts that paradigm, accepts that condition is somewhat interesting, because you have differences in the way the policy is presented. And here, this is actually very relevant to IMF. If you can read, it says, if anyone asks you, just say that we didn't twist their arms, we twisted it ourselves. So this shows that the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister coming to IMF for the structural adjustment loan and going back with some
Bags
loans.
of money.
That's the pots of money. But so the idea was that India was actually getting a good deal. It was sold as we have got a really good deal from the IMF, and nobody twisted our arms. I mean, we twisted it ourselves. So I think it's a very famous political cartoonist in India who probably says more with his cartoons than I can.
Who is the gentleman represent the IMF?
It's not anyone in this room, I must say.
He's smoking.
To be politically correct. But the idea is that when you have a political contestation of a policy change, then you also have pushback, but you also need to have the strength. I mean, the policy establishment needs to have the will to push these measures through. These are not easy things to do. And to be very honest, to be very fair, there was a lot of people, and in hindsight, maybe even me, I think that at that time in 1991, the crisis was brought on by our own policies, our own fiscal profligacy, and there was definitely some justification in having this structural adjustment, which we thought at that point was an imposition, but now looking back, maybe it should have been organic in some ways, but this is where it is. Rajesh, if you could go to the next slide. So what happened in the 1990s, like from 1991 to 2000, and I echo Nora to say that, there was no discussion of inequality at that time on the table. It was adjustment, 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 and adjustment. And what the government does very well is adjust on the stuff that you actually can adjust. So here, in the 90s, suddenly budgets became very important. So the government would put out these annual budgets and they would set a target and they would say, yes, we have achieved the targets as per the goals or not achieved the targets. So there was this, again, this same person who drew this, it's like a lot of confusion created around what it meant to have a balanced budget and where we are moving, what were the implications of that cut back in the expenditure side, especially in the expenditure side. And here, again, I echo Nancy by saying that there's much less talk of the tax side, and I'll show you something which says that. But on the expenditure side, there was a very much of a consensus that we need to balance the books. We need to have kind of some sort of a contraction in the way that we do our expenditure. Maybe efficiency was on the table, but for us, it was not very evident. So it was essentially do the budgets well, just cut where it is needed, and then the consequences of that was very evident. This is Angus Deaton. I'm not sure whether you can read the statement. But so over the 90s, it became very contested that whether this IMF World Bank structural adjustment policies had any impact on inequality and growth or inequality and redistribution. And the newly minted Nobel laureate Angus Deaton and John Drèze had this seminal paper called Inequality in India, a re-examination, because the first paper had some problems in data issues, so they quickly put it down, and then they wrote another paper. And it essentially said, we don't know what happened. Over the 10 years of the structural adjustment period, we don't know whether there was unprecedented improvement or widespread impoverishment. So that leaves policymakers in a quandary, right? Like you're told that, well, if you do this, then there'll be growth, and then you will have better distribution. But after 10 years of the policy, what you have is, well, we don't know what happened, essentially. So that was from the consumption side. And again, we can contest the data and look nitpick, but this was their observation. So I think one of the interesting things is also that there was one paper which was in World Bank Economic Review in 2005 by Banerjee and Piketty, before he sold 1 million copies and before Banerjee did RCTs, which actually looked at a very long time series starting in 1922 until about 2000. It's a very long time series. They collected data from the Income Tax Gazette of the Government of India, and they sort of did this. They constructed a distribution. Of course, it's very difficult to do, and I don't understand the whole technique, but what they were saying is essentially, the next slide, is that from 1920s, there was an increase in inequality. This is top 1% of the population, what the share of income of the 1% of the population. And it increased to about 25-30%. And then in the middle part of the graph, from about the 1950s, there was a steep decline. Actually, throughout the independence period, before 1991, there was a decline in the share of top 1% of the population. And obviously it's pretty evident if one is from India that at one point of time we had marginal tax rates of over 100% in the mid 70s, which was unsustainable. I remember my father complaining all the time that I give more in taxes than I earn. So now I understand what marginal tax rates are. So, but then it also had a declining impact. I mean, a decreasing impact on inequality. However, the second upward trend started exactly around 1991, when and I'm not making any causation, but just the fact that the sudden decrease and then sudden increase started around the time when structural adjustment policies were implemented, shows that there is some impact, or there was something that we missed a trick. And I was looking at any studies recently. I think people got very tired of this, quibbling with the data, but Credit Suisse, who is also mentioned in your book several times, the Global Wealth Report, says that the top 1% in India now own 53% of the wealth, which, if it's true, that means we are going kind of the Latin America way, where we are going to face this huge inequality now going forward, and trying to address it through policies which sometimes can be very difficult to implement. So I have kind of 4 big messages or takeaways from the last 25 years, apart from the fact that I have a few gray hair and sitting on the same stage as the IMF, not protesting on the street. I think the first point is that, as Rajesh mentioned, I think tackling inequality today at any point of time requires tackling the legacies of policies. And I think the legacy that we know today, and the first slide that Rajesh showed, the Occupy movement, that's a legacy also of policies that were followed over the last 10, 15 years in this country and other places. And dealing with these legacy issues can be very tricky, especially when one is trying to balance efficiency with equity. And the second point is the composition of the fiscal adjustment matters a lot. And chapter 9 of the book, I managed to quickly read through a few of the observations. Chapter 9 actually says that very, very clearly, that IMF prescriptions, at least for me, and not the book says, have focused more on the expenditure side, but not much on the revenue side, which may be inequality enhancing in the long run. And I think that's a very new perspective that the book also brings in, to say that you have to do much more than what you're doing now. The third point is, I think, related to the work that we are doing at CGD on fiscal federalism, especially in health, is that the federal government, and in a federal country, the states have some taxation powers, the center has taxation powers. Sometimes those don't match up. The states have lower taxation powers than the center, which we call vertical inequality. There is a mission creep that happens. Central governments start imposing their will on the states, especially in terms of fiscal rules. And in India, over the last 10 years, from 2005, we had something called the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which mandated revenue deficit to be 0, fiscal deficit to be 3%. Most of the states are complying with it. In fact, some states are revenue surplus. The center is running quite large deficits on its side. So that also is reflected on the expenditure side, when the center is telling the states, the federal government is telling the states, that you have to get your fiscal books in order. So compress expenditure on items that, like health, like education. In fact, over the 90s, there was hardly any recruitment of teachers and doctors. It was a freeze, complete freeze. So what we are seeing today, the low level of one of the reasons for the lack of quality in education in terms of learning outcomes, might be also legacy issues coming from those compression and kind of freeze unemployment, which were essentially fiscal. So, and that creates problems. When the federal government is trying to impose its will, it's not that it knows everything. It's also trying to balance many, many different kind of ideas and so on. So it sort of creates this imbalance which sometimes is difficult to rectify. Thankfully, in India, we just had a change in fiscal rules where the previous way that the money was transferred from the government of India to the states had this spaghetti kind of a, different small buckets and trying to move money to the states through different channels. And this imposes costs of compliance at the state level, right? Like if a state government, if I'm a finance minister or a bureaucrat at the state level, I don't know which stream to juggle with, right? So thankfully, earlier this year, we have moved to this new, which I call the sushi system. So it's like a chopstick rather than a spaghetti. So it's kind of interesting that there was this big bang change in the way in which money is now going to be transferred to the federal or the state governments. And essentially, the federal government is saying, look, I cannot address issues of health, education, inequality, and you have to come step forward. I'm empowering you with fiscal resources. You have the better judge. You are the better judge of policies that are more applicable to your case. And a country like India with 1.3 billion people, 1.25 actually, not exactly 1.3, but it is an unmanageable situation when the center wants to dictate and try to move all the levers. So I think at one level we have an opportunity, and this is a very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to track this change in fiscal transfer mechanism, because this is going back to the pre-IMF, pre-1991 era, when the states were much more fiscally empowered, although the level was much lower. Of course, we didn't have the growth that we had over the last 20 years, but it actually is going back to the previous pre-91 or pre-1990s situation. And now, again, we start the whole process. It's like the wheel turning a full circle. So how we use this, whether we'll go the same route again, get into another fiscal mess, hopefully not. But it is important to also understand that this can also serve as a model for other countries if we want to look at lessons from India. So last but not the least, I wish this book was written 25 years ago, so I would have spent more time in the classroom and not in the streets. Thank you.
I have to say, I like the idea of you out on the streets protesting. Thank you very much, panel. Let's have some follow-up questions. I want to pose a question to some of you, first of all. Minsu, Nora Lustig, between you, how do you reconcile this difference that you have? The book says very clearly inequality within countries has gone up. Nora, your studies, as you've shown us today, would tend to disagree. How do you reconcile that? Where does that difference come from? How do you kind of bridge that gap between you? Minsu, first of all.
Well, Laura's statistic made this very clear. I mean, 1/3 of country, even in the low-income country, and the income inequality increase. 1/3 drops, 1/3 doesn't change at all. So Laura emphasized 1/3. I emphasize 1/3. Nancy may emphasize another 1/3, right? But overall, for all I should show some from my slides. For the old advanced economy in the past 30 years, income inequality actually increased quite a bit. So it is a global phenomenon. I think that's the issues, and everybody agree with. And if you're looking for the panel, I think that's it. I hope, Laura, you agree with me.
Okay, so I think to some extent I do.
The first thing is say agree or disagree.
Let me hedge. I think that we would have to look at the source. I don't know if you're using SWID. If you're using SWID, I have a lot of criticism to that. So, but you're not using SWID. Second, that's a database. The second thing is the time period. We would have to look at, if you look at over 30 years, I was talking about the last 15 years. over the last 30 years, we cannot say a lot because many countries didn't have data, but probably over time, maybe we would find a generalized increase over the 30 years. Because one of the things that happened also is a transition from centrally planned economies to market economies. So your own country is one in which inequality went up. The Soviet Union, when it broke up a lot, and a lot of countries, inequality went up by a lot. But in the last 15 years, it's not on 1/3. It's actually more than 50% of the sample that I showed in which inequality declined. And those are 5-year averages at the bottom and 5-year averages at the top. So we're not picking, cherries when we say that happened. With all the caveats about the data, but still, in so many countries that there is a process in some part of the region in which inequality has fallen. And in Latin America, it's been generalized. It's quite interesting. When I started studying, and before the book that looks at the trends in inequality in Latin America was published, I was at UNDP. And then, we started with this project. We said, we want to know why inequality doesn't decline in Latin America. Why is it so persistently high? Surprisingly, once we started looking at the data, I said, well, but there's some countries in which it's falling. And then as the years went by, more and more countries were showing this decline. So that region clearly went through a different story. I think that also what's happened, and it's pretty common, because the US is so powerful that whatever happens in the US actually dominates the discourse. When Piketty published his book in France, some people paid attention. When it was published in English and he came to the US, it sold 1 million copies. The US has experienced a tremendous increase after years of no change. And I think that has influenced a lot of the discourse throughout the world. China experienced an increase, and it's a big country, so it's very important. India also, I think the consensus now, although there's still discussion, Russia experienced it. So some of the big countries, and South Africa, after apartheid went away, actually inequality increased because inequality within the black population went up. So there's some iconic countries in which inequality has risen, and I think that's what's driving the discourse. But look at the Latin American story. It's a different one, and it probably has underlying lessons of what can be done to counter the forces that drive inequality upwards. So I think that's.
Can I just make a point here? Maybe it's a question for Nora. I mean, there's an additional theory about this, which is that when you're at very high levels of inequality, you're more likely to get its regression to the mean. So the countries, including in Africa, that have experienced reductions in inequality were countries that had the highest initial inequality. So even now, Latin America is still far more unequal, despite these declines, than India, China, many other places.
That's true. Most of the data shows there's been convergence.
Also, one point, if I may, if you're looking for the low-income inequalities, I think we've got to be very careful looking for what stage country it is.
Yes.
Because the key drive force for low-income country inequality drop is the wage inequality.
Right.
The wage inequality is very much driven by two things. Number one is the globalization. Number two is the Lewis Kinkel, the labor supply.
Right.
More and more countries reach to the Lewis Kinkel, the wage inequality shrinks. So they move into the more better sense, right? And more globalization, wage push. So particularly when you talk about in the past 15 years, I think that those two things and really push the income inequality. But we got to be very careful because when they move to the relatively high level, whether the states or the system can maintain that trend, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. The real concern for low-income countries, be very careful from the wage sort of inequality drop, but the wealth inequality increase dramatically because the wealth accumulation process is much faster and stronger in the low-income country, particularly in the emerging market. So in that sense, I think yes, in Latin American countries, we see those things. But if we're looking for today, when the growth is slowing down, the real concern, my takeaway from Lima is when growth slows down, income inequality picked up now.
Yes, right.
And so that's also show If you don't have sort of a nature drive the growth, you got to be very careful on your policy.
What
design.
happens in Brazil in the next 5 years?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Now,
Exactly, yeah.
but education is also very important because what like I said, what we found is that in the countries in which wage inequality declined, it is because the premium to higher levels of education has shrunk. And that has been because it's very simple. It's a relative supply of workers
more highly educated.
with higher levels
yeah,
of education has increased faster than the demand for them. It's a story of demand and supply.
Now, panel, I'm just going to put my journalist hat back on. And you know, as journalists, we don't really like details. We just go for the headline. A lot of what you seem to be saying, Nancy particularly, is tax the rich.
Yes, I am saying that.
Politically, how feasible is that?
It's more feasible than we think for two reasons. One is it's more feasible in a country like the US. It's not politically feasible right now. But, you know, Piketty, one thing I learned from Piketty's book is that in early 1920s, I think it was, if anyone wants to take a guess at what was the marginal tax rate at the highest levels in the US? Pardon me?
90%, around 90%.
It's about 75 or 80%.
75%.
So, you know, it's been done. So that's one, when you get the right politics and the right sense of crisis around the Gilded Age or whatever, it can happen. Maybe this was earlier, I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up now. The second reason why I think there's more scope for it and to motivate that, to go back to this issue of fairness and compliance, you know, you need in countries like Brazil and increasingly in India for people to feel as though the system is fair. Otherwise, they go to the streets, and there's a sense of injustice. And so the problem right now is that there's very little knowledge by the state of what is the income of the rich, because it's so easy to avoid reporting your income. That's why I go back to the long, hard slog of developing the institutions that would enable the mapping of people's property ownership, right? And the systems that would allow for wage deductions from income in the private sector, just the kind of personal income tax system that we have in this country and in many countries of Latin America, but without all the loopholes that enable the rich to escape taxes. Now, we know, economists know, and I'm sure Sanjeev and others will say, it won't make that much difference in revenue terms. Is that right? Yeah. However, the question is whether in the medium term it makes a difference in either some combination of the sense of fairness, compliance in general, and thus, you know, alignment with incentives at the local level when you have more of this personal income tax associated with whether you're mayor or your city council. Even though there's not perfect alignment, it creates more pressure for accountable government in that sense.
Yeah, I think Nancy has a more important point, far beyond the tax the richest. Because Nancy had a point, I think that's my takeaway. It says, the old orthodox says, when you do the taxation, you focus on efficiency. Then you move on the redistribution of the function, equality issues on the expenditure side. Right. But now it's over. We should start with tax policy to think about inequality issue as well. And I think that's very important issues. So that's varies. It's not only tax the rich is a part of that. You know, improve the tax efficiency, close the loophole, reduce the energy subsidies, and bring the concept of reduced inequality built into the tax system reform is absolutely important issues. So if you can do that, you can have a both tax revenue increase, efficiency increase, but reduce the inequality.
Yes.
I think that's very important. This is a very important new concept. This is a very important new policy framework I'll give you one case. In Peru, we just come back from Peru. We started doing the technical system with Peru in middle 90. At that time, Peru have a tax revenue only to GDP 6%.
Whoa.
After 5 years, the tax revenue increased to 13%. Now, we are struggling within different corporate tax, income tax, and all those things. The VAT, obviously, the easy one. They want to stick with us, go further. So in the next 5 years, the tax revenue increased from 13 to 70%. It takes 10 years, it takes time, but you have a tax revenue almost 3 times. That's really meaningful. But meanwhile, they will be able to maintain the income inequality at the same level. Because in the 10 years, when we do the the technical assistance, we do advise very different tax policies across different things. Yeah, corporate tax, for example, is very important. Income tax is still very low, but it's very important, right? And reduce subsidy, improve efficiency. With different stage, let me emphasize, you need deploy very different or employ very different tax policy. You can do both. So that go back to Nancy's headline, not only for efficiency on the tax side, but also on the inequality issues, and combined with expenditures, you can achieve both.
Interesting. Anit, quick point to you, then I'll open up to the audience. How does what you've heard here today, talking about getting the right tax policies, how does that square with what Prime Minister Modi in India is trying to do in bringing in a nationwide general sales tax, which would appear to be pretty regressive?
It's going to hurt my strugglers, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
The poor.
And the poor, too.
And,
The very
India has a
poor.
lot of them.
That's a very
Let's
good
not forget
concept.
about the poor.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I mean, hearing this discussion, it's really very, very pertinent for India. We had a saying that you need to do in fiscal policy, you need to do the right things, but also know how to do them right. So you can increase from a 6% to a 17% over a 10-year period, but you would choose the low-hanging fruit first for kind of getting to the target. If you set a target of 15%, then it so happens that the tax administration will go out and do that. But in terms of the VAT or goods and service tax, and I fully agree that that's the easy way to do. I mean, easy in the sense you can ram it through. It's not politically easy. We have constitutional amendments and this and that, so it's kind of got stuck. And IMF has been giving technical assistance for a long time, trying to get India to move to a integrated GST. But I worry about distributional consequences, to be very honest, because our tax GDP ratio is stuck about 10%. It's not increased. Sorry, it's 10.2.
The states are taxing, too.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the center here.
Center, yeah.
So the most of the buoyancy at the central taxes. So I'm looking at the center here. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. But 10% is still, we can do much, much better, right? The GST, to be very honest, we already have a VAT, so it's not that it's kind of a whole new structure. So I don't know how much of the marginal gains will be. But more importantly, I think what's happening on the subsidy side, where we are trying to target energy subsidies better, the use of technology, use of the unique identification number to transfer money directly to consumers, reducing wastage, reducing leakage. Those are the issues, targeting the poor better, saving $2 billion a year on energy, on just cooking gas subsidy through elimination of bogus accounts. This is, there is, I think, a blog Nancy wrote on how to restructure subsidies to benefit the poor, which is outside and on the table, and I think we should all read that. Because if we are looking at a tax and an expenditure policy together, I think we need to look not only on what the marginal tax rates and the increased or move to a GST would be, but also to what we can do right on the subsidy management and expenditure side.
Okay, great. Let's get some questions from the audience now. We have a couple of microphones coming around, so if you could put your hands up, then when a microphone comes to you, please stand up, say who you are, and I urge you to ask a question, not a statement, please. I'll take a couple of questions and then we'll put them to the panel. So, lady here, first of all. Anybody else? Okay. Then we'll go to you next.
Hi, I'm Email, reporting for MarketWatch. I have two questions for Dr. Zhu about China's. So last Monday, Credit Suisse put out a report saying China has the biggest middle class in the world, surpassing the US. And so what do you think China can utilize this growing middle class to transit from export-driven to a consumption-driven economy? And the second question is that last Friday, President Xi Jinping pledged China will lift its country's 70 million of people out of poverty line by 2020. And what do you think the challenges China face to achieve this goal? And what fiscal policy can China adopt to achieve this goal? Thank you.
Okay, and then gentleman in blue suit too.
Should I ask it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, I'm Axel. I'm a student at George Washington University, and I'm an RA for Daniel Leipziger at the moment. And my question is, how does the fall in commodity prices across the world, especially given the fall in demand from China, affect, it has important implications for Latin American countries, decreasing fiscal spaces. How will that affect, the focus on inequality in the long term? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Minzu, those first two questions from this lady were directed at you. How can China utilize its growing huge middle class to achieve its goal of lifting more people out of poverty? And it said that it will lift 17 more million people out of poverty by 2020. What fiscal policies can it use to do that?
Oh, thank you for this question, for those two very important questions. And but I have to declare first, since I'm Chinese, of course. But at the front, I oversaw more than 90 countries, but not China because I'm Chinese. So, and also I do not represent Chinese authority because I work for the IMF. So I'm an international civil servant. I live in Washington. I even don't pay US tax, which is not too bad at all.
Three great disclaimers, which mean you can speak openly now.
No, so that's me. I do not represent Chinese authority, nor on the IMF. I'm particularly on the China issues. So, be very careful. Yeah, I think the growing middle class will be the drive force for Chinese economic growth and the social stability as well. So I think it's absolutely important. China is moving away from investments, export-driven growth model to more consumption-driven model. A big middle class is absolutely important, will play a very important role. I think the reason China is moving into the consumption-driven growth model, and because reasons the current investments growth model is not sustainable. And the way the middle class increase, clearly you have to meet their need. You have to move into the consumption growth model. But that have a huge implication for China rebalancing internally because the whole, for example, manufacture structure, export structure, and the whole import structure from the whole world will change. For example, China will import more consumer goods, and less commodity, for example. And will have a profound global impact as well. I think that those are very important. This is a sort of a turning point for Chinese economy, rebalancing, move into the next phase. I think that's very, very important. Meanwhile, as you say, China still have a lot of people live under the poverty. China successfully lifted 400 million people out of poverty. I think this is really, on human history, it's a really great success. But still, there are people very poor. Now, it's really a tough job now because the poor people live in the remote areas, for the various reasons, family reasons, aging, and the sickness, all those things bring them together. So the general policy probably will not work. More specific, more target policy for specific group, for specific area, for specific education, human capital investments, and I think those things probably will bring them out of poverty by 2020.
Okay, and then the next question from our student colleague here. How will the fall in commodity prices affect inequality? Nancy, you just came back from Lima where you talked about this on a panel, didn't you, on commodity prices. Why don't you take this question?
Well, I would be concerned. I'm interested to know what Nora thinks. There's a very good paper by another colleague, Augusto de la Torre, at the World Bank, where he suggests that it is I mentioned this, that the commodity export boom in Latin America generated a lot of jobs at a certain level of skill that's very well represented by the strugglers and the new, more income-secure middle class as well. So it did not generate as much demand for the highly educated, skilled labor as earlier periods of growth in Latin America did, which were importing a lot of capital, and capital is complemented rather than substituted, usually with highly skilled people. So my concern is that the reductions in inequality in Latin America, driven by increases, were driven substantially by increases in wage levels for a certain group of people who were earlier poorer than the average, let's say, or than the median. And so now with the decline in the number of those jobs, which were generated oddly in the commodity sector, not directly, but all the extra retail and shipping and all kinds of backward linkages associated with export mining and so on, and in the oil economies, right? So well, let's see what happens, but that would be my concern, is that it'll be a shift back to a different kind of labor that will generate more demand again for the more educated and drive up their incomes relative to the wages of the less skilled.
Nora.
Yeah, no, it looks like my role is to disagree a little bit with what the multilaterals are saying. I'm well aware of Augusto's hypothesis, and I think it works for the southern cone, for South America, but it doesn't work for Mexico and Central America.
Right, that's true.
Mexico and Central America, where commodities are either neutral or they're net commodity importers. So when the boom happened, they were hit negatively. Still, in Mexico and in Central America, inequality declined. So I think that when you look at what's been the common thread around Latin America over the last 15 years is the expansion of people with tertiary education, both in commodity exporters and commodity importers. So for me, that's the underlying factor.
Supply side.
It's a supply side. It's a change in the composition of the labor force. And it's the opposite of what happened in the US, by the way. The story by Larry Katz and Claudia Golden, they explain the increase in inequality, in wage inequality in the US, because the growth of people with tertiary slowed down. In Latin America, it accelerated. And that's common throughout. So the commodity boom probably is a story that complements the other underlying force. But let me say that I do think that the fiscal space is going to decline. And that's going to cause probably a retrenchment in the fiscal expansion in terms of cash transfers. Maybe not in terms of cover, but the way they do it is they don't adjust it to inflation, et cetera. So I think the fiscal shock is going to be very important in terms of being able to use fiscal policy as a really
since you mentioned fiscal, can I add one thing for this quickly? The first issue is for the commodity cycle, we should not only looking for the supply side, the demand side, net to net, commodity price drop is a good thing for global. I think that's very important. If the authority, I'm going to use authority, the country can have a proper, for example, energy subsidy policies, cut the subsidies, and the poor people, more general population were getting better for the whole world. I think that's a very important first issue. The second issue is, because there's change in the job market, but also fiscal space have been squashed. Saudi, for example, run 19.3% in negative fiscal deficit this year.
Wow.
So they have to cut.
Wow.
But then come to the policy, well, yeah, it's sustainable, huge.
So they could cut their energy subsidies.
Exactly. We strongly urge them to do that.
Right.
Now, when you have a smaller fiscal space, it's a very important. You have to cut. You have no choice, but maintain social safety nets. I think this has become absolutely important, which is one of our key policy advice for many countries today.
Can you make your point in 30 seconds? Because I do want to get to it.
Countries like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan are laughing their way to the bank.
They're happy.
With the
decline in prices.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
This is the moment to have exactly what
The
Mr. is
cuts
saying. Get energy, the subsidy reform in place. Don't let this pass through to consumers at the way that US is doing.
Right.
So have sensible policies to take advantage of this day, because one day will come when the oil prices will be again $100. Hopefully not.
And this is what India's doing with the jam system,
Yes,
for example.
exactly.
Let's get another question for this gentleman over here, and then we'll get one more. That guy looks very insistent.
Sanjay.
Peter Sturm. I used to work for the OECD and the German Development Service. First, I want to thank the panel for a stimulating presentation. I have a couple of questions.
Keep it to just one, please.
They are connected. You can interrupt me if it becomes boring, okay? The general wisdom is that extreme inequality is bad for growth and stability. On the other hand, I haven't heard anybody advocating absolute equality. Now that suggests there is some sort of optimal inequality level. And I want to ask the panel whether they can characterize that optimum. Obviously, a Gini coefficient can do it, because any intermediate Gini coefficient can have many different income distributions. So could you elaborate on what the optimal income distribution is and what characterizes it? Second question echoes Nora Lustig's remark on balance between worry about inequality and poverty. I want to focus or to crystallize that question by the following two hypothetical scenarios. If you have a policy that lowers inequality but increases poverty, should you go for it or not? Secondly, if by miracle you have a country that abolished poverty, how important is it then for that country to still worry about inequality? Now, I'm an economist myself. I know the correct answer to these two questions. And the correct answer is, it depends. Now, I want the panel to elaborate on what it depends on.
Very good question.
Thank you.
Wow, very good questions. Okay, I'm glad we stated two of them. Okay. Let's actually take our... go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Matthias Medina. I'm an agricultural economist, and my question is about the taxing the financial and capital revenue, and how is it feasible in general, and especially considering the fiscal paradises and tax evasion techniques.
Very good question, too.
Good question.
Okay, all good questions.
Amazing questions.
Let's take... I like your second question best of all, actually. Let's start with that. The policy choice between inequality and poverty, what does it depend on?
I think that's a Nora
That's
question.
Okay, so first, but let me answer also the first one. It's linked to the second question. I think, for me, an optimal income distribution would be given by two factors. First, I would like to get rid of all the inequality that's generated by market failures, by discrimination, by exploitation. I don't know what the number is out, but I would like to generate, so get rid of all what the drivers are that generate bad inequalities. And second, I would like to have whatever comes out that allows me to have the bottom of the population at a certain level that's above subsistence or whatever we think the lower level should be. So that would be the outcome for me, the optimal. Second, if something increases poverty and declines inequality, I wouldn't say it depends. I would still put enormous precedence not to have policies that increase in poverty. I think the first obligation of a state is not to make the poor poorer, okay? And then to make the rich less rich, that's the second one for me, but not to make the poor poorer. So I would go for definitely reducing poverty, and even if it doesn't affect inequality. And what was your third one?
Yeah, there's only
That
two.
was it.
Only two. No.
Somehow, would you still worry about inequality?
Yes, I would, because that's connected with, with the first point, that if you have inequalities that are driven by unfair, exploitative, discriminative, or appropriation of rents, then I still think you want to get rid of them, even if you don't have poverty, although poverty is a relative phenomenon, so it will always be with us in that sense.
Yeah, if I can add one thing, is Laura just mentioned avoid the market failure. I think this is very important. This is the government function, the policy function, but also avoid the government failure. Yeah, there's two hands also. I think if we can do that, a lot of policy reform, like energy subsidy reform, is actually to avoid the government failing.
Right.
So this is also, there's many things, tax exemptions, all those things. There are a lot of room to do that. So we need to avoid both sides.
Good questions. And the last third question came from the gentleman over here, talking about how useful, how effective, how could you make use of things like taxes on financial capital, financial transaction taxes, on reducing inequality. Is that right? Yeah. Who'd like to take that on very briefly, Nancy?
Well, here at the center, we've given some thought to issues at the global level, at the systemic level. And I think your question goes to the issue that the OECD recently put out a report on how to deal with base erosion and profit shifting and all the things you read about in the paper about Apple and Europe and so on and so on. Your question also goes to the thing that we don't do at the global level, which is look for some sort of a centrally collected small tax that could be used collectively to address truly global problems or reduce truly global risks like the risks associated with climate change. At the center, we'd like to see some collectively collected money used to create incentives for tropical forest country governments to improve their policies, reduce the illegality associated with the commercial pressures for logging and burning the forests and so on. Well, so it's a big controversy about a financial transactions tax. I think there's enough resistance to that for various reasons that it's tough, but I do have a paper that you can find on our website that pumps for a different sort of currency transactions tax. Tiny, 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 that would go through a place in Switzerland which already is used by people doing foreign exchange trading. They pay a small fee. It's to deal with the transaction itself in an efficient way, et cetera, very wonky. But I think your question goes to the heart of, for developing countries, how to deal with tax evasion in the richer countries that in the end deprives them of some of their revenue on the corporate side and on the personal income tax side if they were taxing personal incomes.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to stay here and talk more, but we are out of time. Nancy, thank you for doing the website plug, cgdev.org. Find out much more about all our work there. There are papers from some of our panelists out front for you to take away with you. Some copies of the IMF's new book is out there, and I've been asked to remind you that if you'd like to buy a copy, it is available for sale on the IMF's website. Get it for free out there. But please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed. Very interesting.
Good session.
So we're gonna